Hello, I'm Sarah and I work with Hope UK, a Christian drug education charity. We have been working with children and young people for more than 170 years, helping equip them to make drug-free choices. We work in schools, youth clubs, churches, wherever we get invited, and we train adults like parents, youth workers and community leaders, as well as working directly with young people. In this short seminar, I'll be talking about what, if anything, the church might have to contribute to drug issues in their community. I know you might be thinking you haven't got a problem with drugs in your church, or maybe that it is an issue that is too difficult to deal with. I'm hoping to show you that it is very relevant for your work, and that there are simple things that you can do that will help make a difference. I'm also going to suggest places where you can get further help should you need it. So, we will start by thinking about whether the drug issue is relevant for the church. Then we will look at what your church might need to consider if you're thinking how your church might respond to the drug issue. And then from that, what steps you might take to help address these issues in your church and your community. In thinking about what steps to take, we will briefly look at how you develop a church drug policy, whether you could implement some drug and life skills training for both your workers and your young people, and what pastoral help and other support you might provide for people with drug issues. It's quite possible that you're doing many of these things already, so hopefully you'll either find it encouraging or maybe I'll highlight a couple of new ideas or things for you to think about. Before we start, I just want to let you know what I'm referring to when I'm talking about drugs. You can see the definition we usually use on the screen. A drug is a substance apart from food that when put into the body changes the way the mind and body works. In this seminar, when I talk about drugs, I won't always be referring to illegal substances. It may also be relevant to medicines, alcohol, cigarettes and inhalants like nitrous oxide. They are the little grey canisters that you sometimes see on the street. So, does the church have any reason to think about this issue? It would be nice to think that drugs don't affect the church, but your young people and church members are living and working in the wider world, and sadly are not exempt from coming into contact with and possibly using drugs. I'm going to start with a few stories just to get you thinking. If this had happened in your church, would you have known what to do in each instance? Then I'm going to show you just a few statistics about drug use in the United Kingdom. As I go through them, imagine the people at your church. How might this affect them? Do you do anything about any of these already? If not, how might you? So here are a couple of stories. I want you to imagine you had to deal with this. Does your church already have a strategy in place for these scenarios? Would all of your staff and volunteers know what they should do? In the first instance, Alex, a member of the youth group, has told the youth worker she doesn't want to go home. Her mum has a drink problem and she is fed up with dealing with it. She has to look after her younger siblings and often her mum as well, and that's it, she doesn't want to do it anymore. Okay, she's told your youth worker. What would your youth worker do? Is there any support for Alex? What about her mum and also your youth worker? Would you know where to get help for that family? Or how about Sam, who has told their leader confidentially that although they have been drug-free for a while, they have recently started reusing heroin and they need help to stop. Again, where would you go for help? Do you know the processes involved, how Sam accesses help? Meanwhile, you find out that a group of people have been seen in the church car park regularly smoking cannabis. Church members are complaining to you about this and also the mess that they leave behind. Does it matter that this is happening? Do you have any legal responsibilities at all? Okay, so I've shared those stories and I've got a picture in my head now of one of those puzzles where you have to spot all the mistakes. But of course in real life you hopefully wouldn't have all these at the same time. Any of them, however, are possible. And so I want to suggest that to prepare in advance for these scenarios might be better than having to rush around quickly if they happen. You might still be thinking this is all so unlikely to happen at your church, so let me share some statistics that might be relevant to those you work with. Okay, the first statistic, 35% of school pupils have been offered drugs, means that young people in your youth group probably have been offered drugs. If they do, how will they manage that situation? Do we leave it to them just to get on with it? Or is there something we can do to help them prepare for this? Notice that 24% of school pupils have used drugs at some time. So again, how would your young people manage if they were at a party or out with friends and their friends were using drugs? How can your youth worker help young people who are starting to use drugs? Or what about the ones that don't want to, but are finding it really hard to deal with peer pressure? Is there anything you could do to help them? It's not just young people. About 1/3 of adults have taken drugs at some time. So maybe you don't have youth work at your church, but you might have adults who are using drugs, and some might be getting into difficulties because of their drug use. Roughly 1/4 of adults who drink alcohol, for example, binge on their heaviest drinking day, meaning that they were exceeding low-risk drinking guidelines. Does that matter? Will it affect their health? Would it have any effect on the people that you work with? What about their families? You may have heard the term county lines. This is a term used when drug gangs from big cities expand their operations to smaller towns, often using violence to drive out local dealers and exploiting children and vulnerable people to sell drugs. These dealers will use dedicated mobile phone lines known as deal lines to take orders from drug users. You might have heard stories of children going missing for a while and then turning up distressed or tired, or with money perhaps, or unwilling to say where they've been. How can you help children and young people that you work with know if someone was trying to recruit them? What should they do? Where would they go for help? Would you know how to spot the signs of a young person being groomed? Do you know who could help them? Wouldn't it be great if churches could be equipped to help prevent these situations from occurring and to help young people be safe? One girl we worked with, I'll call her Rita, said, "I grew up in an area where there is a lot of drugs, gangs and knife crime. A friend of a friend who is a gang member saw me and asked if I could take his bag across the road to someone. Before being involved with Hope UK, I knew about drugs and county lines because of where I grew up. Being part of Hope UK has made me understand more about drugs and gangs. I am more vigilant. I was so confident when I said no." I wonder if there is a way your church could help young people be able to manage a situation like this. Since your church members are living in the real world, clearly some will be impacted by drug use and these wider issues I've been talking about with my statistics and stories. If you're a church leader, I know that you can be very busy and will often find yourself reacting to things as they happen, but I think that with a little bit of planning, you might be able to react better if and when things happen, and maybe even help minimise to a certain extent drug harms in your community. Those statistics and stories that we looked at might influence what you want to do in your church. For example, what help or support might you want to give the children and young people who attend your church or that your church has contact with? Who would give that support and what would it look like? Is it something your family or youth worker would be dealing with? Or could there be a wider church input? And do you know the legal responsibilities you have regarding buildings that you own or hire? Do you have a policy in place with relevant procedures to make sure that you're fulfilling these requirements? If those people were really smoking cannabis in the car park, what should you or could you do? What if you do have people with dependency issues? How might you help them? And what about their families? Often, families of drug users get overlooked. You might need to think about a team effort, with one person supporting the person trying to overcome a dependency, obviously with help from the experts, and others helping and supporting the family. I would suggest that it is worth spending some time, maybe with your team if you have one, thinking about these things and drawing up a church drug policy. This will outline what you plan to do regarding any of these issues that you think might affect your church, and put procedures and strategies in place so that everyone who works for or volunteers for your church or uses the building is clear about expectations, rules, and what to do if anything happens. There are many things a drug policy can cover, and I can't explain everything here. These are just some of them. You would want to have an overview of what your policy will be. This will vary from church to church, depending on the community you serve. I'm going to show you soon what the law says about managing buildings and drug use, and your policy will need to explain this and then give steps to take that everyone can follow. If you have children and young people, your policy might want to mention how you will help them manage drug situations. I'll come back to this later. And you will want to outline pastoral care for people and families with drug problems. Your policy could list contact details for where you would go to get help. You could have a section around how medicines should be administered if you have a youth sleepover or residential. Some churches might have specific projects that will help drug users or families of drug users, and you might want to include some of these in your policy. There are quite a few things to consider when putting together a drug policy. Hope UK can help you with this if you feel you need it. I've got just a few suggestions on this slide. For example, the laws relating to drug use, safeguarding requirements, even GDPR legislation will be relevant when you put a drug policy together. You can see a link to our website, hopeuk.org/churches. You'll find a document there that can help you with all of this process. You'll see that I've added a line here about the use of legal substances. I know that probably sounds a bit silly, but do you have the same attitude towards alcohol as you would towards cigarettes? You may be fine with one, but not the other. You might want to explore this a bit when you're thinking about what your policy will say. Why do you have a difference of opinion, maybe, about one legal drug and not the other? And will your policy reflect that? I can't go into everything in this seminar, so I thought I would draw your attention to just one example. This is a quote from a 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act. You can see that it does not allow you to turn a blind eye to people using drugs or passing on drugs within your church premises. This includes areas like the church car park or a garden if you have one. It's also relevant if you hire a building for your church services. If you have the authority to ask someone to leave, this law relates to you. So your policy should cover what your workers should do if they think that there is drug use on the premises. How will they manage that situation? Would you want them to ask the person to leave, or would you ask them to confiscate the drugs? If they do confiscate them, what will they do with those drugs and how will they record it? It is okay to confiscate drugs, but then the drugs need to be disposed of in a safe way. You could chat to your local pharmacist or your police to see what they would advise. Would you involve the police in such an incident? You can see that there are quite a lot of things to think about, and I'm sure that you agree with me that your youth worker, for example, probably needs to know all of this before it ever happens. As a charity, Hope UK is particularly interested in equipping young people to make drug-free choices. As I said earlier, you might want to consider how your church might include this in your youth work or in the work you do in your local school, for example. There are obviously all kinds of prevention strategies. These here are just a few of them. I'm wondering if you do any of these already, perhaps without thinking of them as a prevention strategy, but just part of your youth work. If you're going to draw up a policy and plan to help your children and young people, what, if any of these, would you use? You probably would go for the ones you can do easily and also the ones you think would be most useful to the young people you work with. So, for example, a really helpful one that your youth worker might want to develop is the skill development one. There are all kinds of skills you can help children and young people develop. You probably do some of them, but here are some examples. These are really useful in situations where young people are being offered drugs or are around people using drugs, but you can see that they're also quite helpful generally. I think we sometimes assume that people just develop these skills naturally, but actually there is a lot you can do to help people develop and improve these skills, or maybe just to practice them in a safe environment. Easier to try them in advance. We run an 8-session life skill course at Hope UK to cover some of these in a bit of detail. One session, for example, is all about building confidence, but there is only so much that we can do in a short course. Imagine how much more your church can do to help build confidence in the young people that you work with regularly. If you feel that you are not quite ready to do some of this yet, or it's far too complicated, we are more than happy to help you. You could start just by getting some training for yourself and for your workers. Or if you're struggling and lack resources, you can invite us to work directly with your youth group. In the resources section of our website, resources.hopeuk.org, there are activities for parents to use with their children, for youth workers to use with your youth group, and there are e-learning modules for use by individuals. Your church might find some of these helpful. They've all been developed to make them as easy to use as possible. If you are a pastor or a church leader, you might be thinking that the issue you most often have to manage is where drug use has started to, or is, causing difficulties for someone you are supporting or for their family. And when you already have lots to deal with, this can seem quite overwhelming. A policy will not help solve the problems, but it can help prepare your team to manage by knowing who will help, where you might go for further help, all that kind of thing. Ways you might help obviously include your normal pastoral care and whatever system you use for this, but it might also be that some of the other services you offer are helping or might help. If you do debt counselling, for example, or run a food bank or a cafe or befriending service, these might all be ways you can help support a family or a user. Some research in advance have been that if someone needs to get counselling or to access drug treatment services, you'll be able to point them in the right direction. You could even have somebody who helps them go through that process and access the help they need. It's much easier when confronted with an issue to have already found out who might help than to have to work quickly under pressure. Two websites that I have found really helpful are Talk to Frank and AdFam, which both signpost you to local services, and you can search Christian rehabs on the internet. I have found these rehabs really helpful when I've needed a bit of advice, for example. I hope you found this seminar helpful as an introduction to some of the things your church might do to be more proactive in managing drug issues in your church or community. Obviously, this is just a brief overview, and we are more than willing to help you with more training and advice. That's what we're here for, really, if you need us. Thank you so much for watching, and my last slide that's coming up now reminds you of how to get hold of us should you want to. Thank you.
All right, so stand up and give it a go. Off you go.
So we run a course called Drug, Sex and You, and it's an 8-week course. It's amazing watching young people go through this course. It's brilliant. And we've had young people, for example, who were scared to go into interviews, who we've taught them interview techniques, and they've come back really excited because they felt they've done really well because of the things that we've taught them.
Nothing beats sitting on it, hearing it, tasting it, wearing it, handling it, trying it, comparing it.
The copier produces 1,000 copies for £4. The Riso digital printer produces 1,000 copies for £1.20 at 140 pages per minute.
Discussing it.
The interesting thing about this centre is it's a very difficult breed on a very small site.
Buying it. Recommending it. I definitely recommend it.
It's always good to have resources, and yeah, this is very resourceful, so it's a great place to be.
Nothing beats being here. Buy your tickets online now. creonline.co.uk/tickets.